Well, welcome back. In this video I start making the new seat. So the first thing I do is remove the top section of this plastic guard. I've taken some measurements, and I think there's one thing I've been mindful of is the movement in the rear shockers and how high the rear tyre is going to go. So just to make sure it doesn't bottom out on the bottom of the seat, I'm cutting this top section down, and I'm going to still allow, it's around 20 millimeters higher than the top of the frame, so that should be plenty of clearance. I think it works out to about 80 mil. Without doing this, if you sit the plate flat on the top of the frame, I think it'll actually bottom out on the tyre, so this bit of extra clearance I think will work really well. So just trim it up here, and then for the base of the seat, which will sit over that, and then I'll make like a custom sort of mudguard looking thing to clear the tyre. I'm going to use mild steel, 1.6 mil for the base, and probably the seat itself, the seat part, I'll make 1.6 mil, and the sides I'm going to make out of 1.2 millimeter sheet metal. So just cutting the old rear end. I'm not sure yet what I'm going to do with this, whether I'll put a hoop, whether I'll just put a bar across. Don't know, we'll have to see how this seat turns out. What I've done too is I bought some XPS, so this is expanded polystyrene, or it's sort of like a dense foam, and it's pretty easy to carve. And the idea behind this is just so that I can figure out the overall pattern of seat that I like. Originally, I was intending to use this stuff, sand it all nice, and then make a mould and make the seat out of fiberglass. But, you know, once I got into this and I started carving, I don't know, I just like metal better. So this is the profile I want, and I've decided now I'm actually going to make this out of sheet metal, and I'm just going to use this foam to get the overall pattern that I want sorted out. So here it is here. It's sort of flat tracker or street tracker type look. I was going to go for more of the cafe style with the hump, I suppose. I don't know what you call it. But I didn't think it really suited this bike because I have the handlebars they're not clip-ons. So clip-ons are generally more for a cafe style. So here I'm just cutting this XPS. Just got a Stanley knife or sharp knife. And it's not too bad. I mean, I don't know. After doing this, my thing is definitely metal, and all this did was inspire me to make it out of sheet metal instead. I find that much easier to mess with and to get it to do what I want it to do. Having said that, this was a good base. It allowed me to see what it's going to look like on the bike. So here it is here. I actually like the look of this, so let me know what you think. I sanded just that left side. The right side there I didn't finish because all I've, as I said, used this foam for is just to get a feel of what I'm after in terms of design. So from this point I started to grind up the seat base. So this is the base itself, which will sit directly on the frame. So that's 1.6 mil. I cut that, and then I cut the opening for where the mudguard style sort of curve is going to be added to it to give that extra clearance, as I was talking about before. And you can see it here. So there's the bit I cut out, and I need to make like a raised section, and all of that I decided to make out of 1.6 mil, which is quite thick, but you know, I want that base to be strong. So there it is, curved to the profile of the frame. And once I put the wheel back in there, which is the old wheel, you can see the clearance. It's going to be about 80 mil. And, you know, without raising that up, I really do think that tyre would hit on the bottom, which would be really annoying after all this work. So this was the next stage, just knock up this additional height. And you won't even see this, so the seat will sit obviously on top of that. So I just do a few tacks, bit of hammer work, bit of tigging, and I think it came up pretty good. The time in these sort of things is worth it, getting it right. As you can see here, most of the joins have no gap, and you know, it does take a little bit more time, but it's not massive. Once I fully TIG this up. Because I put the effort in to get it right, you know, it makes it easy to clean up and clean those surfaces before I welded it onto the base itself. So it's nearly done here. Obviously the other benefit of doing metal, in my view, is you get it like this. You know, it was close. It was probably 2 or 3 mil or 4 mil maybe, but a bit of panel beating, a bit of bending here or there, and I find this quite easy to work with. That turns out good. Clean it up, and then I tack it into position onto the bike. There it is here, just welding onto the bike. It turned out really well, so as I said, that gives me that additional clearance I need just as a safety factor. So at this point I start cutting the sides. So what I did is I marked them with paper from my foam template, and just marking off here on this 1.2 mil, also mould steel. So mark that out. To get symmetrical is not that difficult, because what I do is once I cut one side, I give it a quick file, then I mark the second one to make sure it's exactly the same. And then as I bend them, I just check them to make sure they're symmetrical. So quick grind. You could do this with nibblers. I don't, because I don't have any good nibblers, but I will get some at some point. So what I do just to keep it flat is just use a ultra thin cutting disc. Works fine. So cut that. As I said, give it a quick file. Make sure it's tidy, and then I mark a second one off, and then I start bending it. So I just bend it around some pipe and that I have, which I feel's the diameter to provide the radius that I'm after on those sides. There's a bit of leeway. Once I tack this in, I'll move it around later to get the look I want. But the main thing I'm focusing on now is just the front section of this seat and making sure those sidewalls have the overall pattern. I'll tack one side, tack the other side, and then I start putting it on the bike and just getting a feel to see, is this the look and is the design right. So as I said, just this back section, you can see I can still move around and I still have a chance to manipulate that the way I think is going to fit best. Well, progress on this seat is a bit slower than I'd like. I actually have spare time at the moment, but unfortunately right now in Australia there is a massive heat wave going on, and the temperatures are just got ridiculous. So today out here it's actually 44 degrees Celsius, and in the shed it's unbearable. I can only really work at night, so I'll still do as much as I can, but to give you an idea, this gauge only goes up to 50 degrees, and you can see it's maxed out. It's probably 60 plus in the garage at the moment. Well, it's finally cooled down, and the next thing I want to do is make a little concealed drawer for this logbook. I need this logbook because in Australia a bike like this can be classified as a historic vehicle, and one of the conditions are you need to record each ride. And so what I thought is I'll make a concealed drawer, and it gives me somewhere to put this book and pen and maybe a few dollars. So I just make up a little drawer just out of 1.2 mil mild steel, bend it, and then what I did is I went to the hardware store and I found this little mechanism. It's called a push latch, and they normally use that in kitchens to hold drawers and cupboards closed. It's got a little magnetic end, and I thought it would work good for this because it will allow me to have the outside face flush, and you don't need a handle or any means of pulling it out. So you simply push it in a little bit and it will quickly release on a spring and magnet. So what I decided to do is use a 20mm box section as a guide, and the other thing good about this is it acts as a support. So the main weight when you're sitting on the seat is actually about where that guide is, and it just will help make sure I don't wedge that drawer and get it stuck in there. So just follow the drawer down, as you can see here, making sure that there's clearance on the sides of each of the guide, and the back bit's got that little tab, and that just means that it'll stop the drawer from pulling out completely. So I just grind the side, one side, just to allow that drawer to come in and out, and once I get that far, put the drawer in, test it, and it seems to work pretty well. What I do then is I make up this little bracket to hold the push latch, and one of the things I do is I make it in a way that I can remove that push latch from the bottom, because in the unlikely event something goes wrong with it or I need to adjust it, I obviously need to have access to it, and if I don't do this, once I weld the top plate on, I'm never going to be able to get it out. So that seems to work pretty well, and I just bolt that in, test it. It needs a little bit of adjustment to get it to hold properly, and as you can see, it didn't latch first up, but after a bit of mucking around, it latches, it holds well, and I think that spring tension is about right for what I need. So with the draw now working, what I do is finish this base off. At the rear, I want it to flare out a bit, so I make some extra sides for this to push it out just that little bit, and I make one and then I make a duplicate of that just to make sure they're exactly symmetrical. Just bend it into the profile of the base and tack it all in, and then I tack the side to it, and that's basically locked in both sides now. So once this is all welded, I put it on the bike, test it out, and it seems to fit pretty well. After that, I just cut a little end piece to put as a front cover, and you can see just tacking it on here. And then once I get that far, I finish the draw off by adding just a little flat piece, I suppose, just to be flush mounted to the side. And the reason I did this, and the reason for that gap, is if it gets wet for whatever reason, I don't want water to run into the drawer, so I've just created that gap so the water will run in between that gap. I've left an air gap under the front, and it will simply run out. So that's worked out really well, and you can see once it's pushed in, it's flush mounted. You pretty much won't be able to see that. So real happy with the way that's turned out. So the next thing I do is just tidy up the rear profile. I end up lowering the turn on the rear to make that bend a little bit lower. You can see it here, and then I just play around with it a little bit so I don't end up with too much of a sharp sort of bend on it. So I just put a nice radius in there and get it all finished off so that I'm ready to actually put the seat plate on. So once I just make sure it's symmetrical, bit of panel beating, I cut up the seat base and then I progressively weld that on. Now to do that, I also made that a 1.6mm plate because I want that to be a little bit heavier duty, because one of the things I'm critical about here is the extra strength to make sure that I don't end up squashing that drawer in, and that's why I put that box section on the inside of that. So just before I weld it, I give it a light spray just to make sure in the unlikely event water does get in there that I don't want it to rust, and I slowly tack it together. And I do check that drawer quite often because when you tack, metal does shrink, and I just want to make sure it doesn't pull in a way that binds that drawer up, because at this point if something goes wrong and the drawer is jammed, I pretty much have to cut this off again. So I do try to do tacks in stages to limit distortion, and I've welded this up, and you'll see on the top of the plate I've drilled 4 or 5 holes which align to the internal base, and what I do is I put a little spot weld there just to again give it a bit more strength and just make sure that there's minimal chance of that drawer getting stuck by that metal pressing down on it, because it is quite close tolerances. So here it is here all welded up, and at this stage I just cut the pieces I need for those wings, I guess you call it. So here's just another bit of metal profiled to the right shape, filed, very close tolerance, making it easy to tack, and you can see it just blends in really nicely with that rear section. So a few tacks, do that on both sides, and that is pretty much ready to be fully welded. Once I get this bit done, all I do is put it back on the bike and I mark up how I want that rear profile to look. So here's a look at the final profile. You can see where I've marked off in yellow, and what I do then is just grind that to that profile, and then I start working on that top section. So this sort of follows the profile of the frame to a certain extent, but at the rear it goes a bit lower down, and I just, looking at it, I think this profile suits the bike pretty well. So I cut that on both sides, and as I say, then I start making a top plate for that rear tail. Now you might have noticed I'm a bit light on with metalworking tools, so I'm really down to a grinder, a hammer, and in this case a pair of pliers. So really, to take this to the next level for me, which would make it a lot easier, is obviously I need an English wheel and stretching and shrinking tools, and a bender would be great. So for now I'm just improvising with what I've got, and it still turns out pretty well, just takes a little bit more time. So I just bend this radius on both sides, ready for this top cap. Again, the top cap here is radiused both ways, so front to back as well as side to side slightly, and I just did that with a hammer and pliers, and just trying to sit it into position here. It's pretty close at this point, and then what I do is tack it on, tack both sides, make sure it's symmetrical, and then I fully weld it. So this is one of the last welds to finish this seat off. So given it's a radius, it's not a real problem to just TIG this in one go, because the shrinkage doesn't really have as big an impact when you're welding on corners like this. So weld that up, and then what I do is start installing the tail light. So I hunted around a little bit. I decided on a Lucas style tail light, which I thought would be a good look for this seat. When I got it, one of the things I didn't like is it's got like a little ridge in the center, and I took a bit of a chance, and rather than buy something different, I just thought I'd have a go at shaving it down with a Stanley knife, because the lens is quite thick. So I just took that ridge off, because the profile of it I actually like. It's just that point. Put on my buffer wheel with fine compound, and amazingly it just polished up like new. So you can see here, took me maybe 1 or 2 minutes of buffing. I made sure I didn't get it too hot, as it would melt the plastic. Cleaned it up with a rag, and it's as good as new. To hold this tail light, I just make a bracket, and I'm just positioning it here before I TIG it in, just to make sure it's going to fit the way I want it to. And the way I've set it up is just have it sticking out slightly from the end of that tail. So just a couple of TIG welds. I don't fully weld this, there's really no point. So 4 or 5 tacks will hold this. And then once this is done, and I also make the little tab there for the number plate, sit it on the bike, and this is pretty much done now. I'm so happy with the way it's turned out. So that's it for this video. It's been a fairly long video. Next I will sand this down fully, get it ready for a bit of body filler and final priming and paint work. Stay tuned.